He could see them. That is the detail that gets under your skin. A man wakes up after death in a place of torment, and the first thing the story tells us is that he lifts up his eyes, and across some impossible distance, he sees. He sees Abraham, far off, and he sees a man he used to step over, a beggar he barely noticed in life, now resting comfortably at the patriarch's side. The dead man in torment can see paradise, he just cannot reach it. And so he does the only thing left to him. He begs. Not for rescue, not for a second chance. He begs for one drop of water on the tip of his tongue, because, he says, he is in anguish in this flame. One drop, that is all he asks for, and he is refused. This is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, told in the Gospel of Luke, and it is the single most vivid window onto the afterlife that anyone ever attributed to Jesus. It has fire, it has comfort across a chasm, it has named places and a fixed gulf and a thirsting tongue. And because it is so vivid, almost everyone reads it the same way. We read it as a travelogue. We read it as a report, as if Jesus pulled back a curtain and described the actual coordinates of the next world, a real heaven and a real hell, close enough that the damned can watch the saved, with a canyon stretched between them that nobody can cross. That is the postcard version, the man in the fire, the beggar in the light, the gulf in between. If you grew up anywhere near a church, that image is already in your head, fully formed, before you finish hearing the story. It feels like the Bible's clearest map of what happens when you die. But sit with the story for one more second, and something starts to itch. Because this rich man is in agony. He is suffering in a way the text does not soften, and the parable never tells us what he did. He is not a murderer. He is not a thief. Nobody accuses him of fraud or violence or blasphemy. He wore nice clothes, and he ate well. That is, on the surface, the whole charge sheet. So why the flame? Why the refused drop of water? What did this man actually do to earn a sentence this severe? Hold on to that question, because the parable buries the answer so quietly that most people miss it entirely. And there is a second thing planted here, right at the end of the story, that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. The conversation across the chasm does not end with the water. It ends with a strange, chilling line about whether the living would even believe a message brought back by someone who rose from the dead. We will get to who that line is aimed at and why it might be the most unsettling sentence in the whole passage. Here is what I have learned digging into this one. The earliest version of this story, the one in the actual Greek of Luke, is stranger than the postcard. The place words do not mean what the English suggests. The geography people quote so confidently was assembled, layer by layer, over centuries, out of Hebrew shadows and Greek myth and books that never made it into most Bibles, and then hardened into stone and poetry long after Jesus was gone. The man in the fire that you picture is wearing centuries of paint, so let us start peeling. And the very first place to look is not the fire, it is a name. Here is something you can check yourself, and it is the kind of detail that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Go through the parables of Jesus, all of them. The famous ones, the obscure ones, the long ones, the one-liners. Read them looking for proper names, names of the human characters at the center of the story. You will not find any. Think about the parable of the sower. There is a sower. He is just the sower. Think about the prodigal son, maybe the most beloved story Jesus ever told. A father, two sons, and not one of them is given a name. The Good Samaritan, a story so famous the phrase entered every European language, has a man who fell among thieves, a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. No names. The rich fool who builds bigger barns, the man with 2 debtors, the woman who lost a coin, the laborers in the vineyard, the 10 virgins, the wedding guests, the unjust steward. Anonymous. All of them. This is not an accident. A parable works by being a type. The figures are placeholders, slots that you, the listener, are meant to step into. The moment you give a character a name, you turn him from a mirror into a portrait. You make him a specific person rather than an everyone. Which is exactly why this parable is so peculiar. Because in the story of the rich man and the beggar, one character, and only one, is given a name. And here is the twist that should already be raising an eyebrow. It is not the rich man. The wealthy figure, the one the whole drama seems to revolve around, stays nameless. It is the beggar at the gate, the lowest person in the scene, the man nobody in the story so much as looks at, who alone receives a name. He is called Lazarus. In all the parables Jesus ever told, this poor man covered in sores is the only character with a name. That is genuinely unique. And it cannot be incidental. Naming the powerless one and leaving the powerful one as a generic rich man is a deliberate inversion before the story even gets going. The text is doing something with that name. It is pointing. So what does the name mean? Lazarus is the Greek form of a Hebrew name, Eliezer, and Eliezer is built from two pieces that together say something very specific. It means, roughly, God has helped. God is my help. Hold that meaning lightly for now, because it is going to land much harder later when we see exactly who in this story gets helped and who does not. But notice already the quiet irony. The man whose name announces that God has helped him is the man lying in the dirt, hungry, sick, ignored, with street dogs licking his sores. By every visible measure, God has not helped this man at all. The name and the situation are at war. Before we go further, let me say one quick thing. If you enjoy this kind of slow, careful unpacking, where we take something you think you know cold and follow it all the way back to the source, think about subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these. That is the whole pitch. Back to Lazarus. So we have a story shaped like a parable, behaving like a parable, anonymous like a parable, with one strange exception that breaks the pattern and seems designed to break it. A named beggar whose name is a theological statement. That is a clue. It is a clue about who this story is really aimed at and what it is really about. But to read that clue properly, we first have to ask a question people almost never ask about this passage. What kind of story is this actually meant to be? Is it a report or is it a weapon? Let us put the parable back where Luke puts it, because context changes everything. This story does not float free. It sits inside a long stretch of Luke's gospel, the section where Jesus is traveling toward Jerusalem, teaching as he goes, and the audience around him is specific. Just before this story, Luke tells us plainly that the Pharisees, who he says were lovers of money, were listening to Jesus and sneering at him. They scoffed. And it is right there, into that sneering, money-loving audience, that this story drops. That detail is not decoration, it is the frame. Whatever this parable is doing, it is doing it to people who loved money and looked down on the poor. Keep that audience in the room. We will come back to them because they are the real target, and the whole shape of the story bends toward them. Now, the bigger question. What kind of thing is a parable in the first place? Because we have a habit, a very modern habit, of treating every sentence Jesus speaks as a flat statement of fact. But a parable is not a deposition. It is not a survey report filed from the afterlife. A parable is a teaching story, and ancient teachers, Jewish and Greek alike, used vivid scenes, including scenes of the dead, as rhetoric. They reached for the most dramatic imaginable setting precisely because it would land a moral point with force. The afterlife, in a story like this, can be a stage. The point of the play is not the set design. And here is something that genuinely surprised me when I learned it. The basic plot of this parable, a rich man and a poor man whose fortunes are dramatically reversed after death, was not invented out of nothing. It was a known story shape floating around the ancient world. There is a rabbinic tale, preserved in Jewish tradition, about a rich tax collector and a poor scholar whose funerals and afterlives invert their earthly status. And further back, scholars have pointed to an Egyptian folktale, a story sometimes connected to a figure called Setna, in which a journey to the land of the dead shows a rich man in misery and a poor man in honor, with the explicit moral that things look very different on the other side. The reversal after death motif was, in other words, a traveling story. Jesus, or Luke, is reaching for a frame the audience would have half recognized, the way you would recognize the bones of a familiar tale the moment a storyteller began. That matters enormously for how we read the details. If the underlying frame is a known folktale type, then the fire, the chasm, the drop of water, the visible paradise, these may be the inherited furniture of the genre, not a fresh blueprint of the actual cosmos. When you build a story on a borrowed stage, you use the stage that is already there. This is the danger I want to name clearly. There is a real risk in mining a teaching story for geography. It is like reading the parable of the prodigal son and trying to reconstruct the actual floor plan of the father's house. or calculate how many miles the younger son traveled into the far country. You can do it, but you would be answering questions the story never asked, and missing the question it did ask. When you treat a moral drama as a map, you can end up very confident about details the author never meant to defend. So I am not going to tell you, up front, that this is definitely just a story with no information about the next world in it. That would be its own kind of overreach, and we will come back to the genuine debate near the end. What I am saying is that we cannot decide what the parable teaches about the afterlife until we have read its actual words, in their actual languages, as carefully as we can. And the very first word we need to slow down on is the word we translate as the place of the rich man's torment. Because in the Greek that Luke actually wrote, that word is not the one you are expecting. Here is your first real jolt, and it is a textual one. The word Luke uses for the place where the rich man wakes up in torment is, in Greek, Hades. Not hell as we mean it, Hades. Lazarus goes to Abraham's side. The rich man, the text says, in Hades, lifts up his eyes, being in torment. That is the word on the page. Now that might not sound like a big deal, because we tend to treat Hades and hell as synonyms. But inside the New Testament itself, they are not the same word, and the difference is the whole game. Because there is another word, a different word, that Jesus uses elsewhere when he wants to talk about fiery final judgment. And that word is Gehenna. Let me introduce this properly, because Gehenna is your key term for today, and it has a real, physical history. Gehenna is not originally a mythological realm at all. It is a place you could walk to. The name comes from the Valley of Hinnom, a ravine that runs along the southern and western edge of the old city of Jerusalem. In the Hebrew Bible, this valley has a dark reputation. It is named as a site where, in the worst periods of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, people carried out child sacrifice by fire, burning offerings to foreign gods. The prophets cursed the place by name. Jeremiah declares that it will become a valley of slaughter. It became in the imagination a cursed and defiled ground, a place associated with fire and burning and the refuse of judgment. And by the time of Jesus, that real geographical valley had become a metaphor. Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, became a word for the fiery place of final punishment. When Jesus, in the Gospels, warns about being thrown into the unquenchable fire, about the worm that does not die, about it being better to lose an eye than for your whole body to be cast into Gehenna, that is the word he uses. Gehenna, the fire word, the judgment word. He uses it more than once, and it is unmistakably about a fiery fate. So here's the thing almost nobody notices about the rich man and Lazarus. This is the most fire-filled, torment-filled afterlife scene in all of Jesus' teaching. The rich man is literally in flame, begging for water. If there were ever a place to use the fiery judgment word, this is it. And the parable does not use it. Not once. The word Gehenna does not appear anywhere in this story. The word the text reaches for instead is Hades. Why would that be? If Jesus, or Luke, simply wanted to say the rich man is in the fires of hell, the vocabulary for exactly that was sitting right there, used elsewhere in the very same gospel tradition. Choosing Hades instead is a choice, and I want to suggest it is a meaningful one, deliberate, not careless. Because Hades and Gehenna are not interchangeable, they carry different freight. Gehenna is the final fire, the judgment after the end. Hades is something else. Hades is the realm of the dead, the underworld, the place where the dead simply are before any final reckoning. That distinction is going to turn out to matter a great deal, and it is going to reframe what kind of punishment this even is. But to understand what Hades meant to a Greek-speaking Jewish writer like Luke, we cannot stop at the Greek. Because Hades, in his hands, is itself a translation, a Greek coat thrown over a much older, much stranger Hebrew word. To understand the rich man's location, we have to go down, beneath Hades, to the oldest layer of all. We have to go to a place the Hebrew Bible calls Sheol. So let us go down into the oldest layer. Before there was Hades on the page, there was a Hebrew word underneath it, and that word is Sheol. And here's the thing that will quietly unravel the whole postcard, so I want to say it slowly. In the Hebrew Bible, Sheol is not hell. Sheol is not heaven. Sheol is not a place of fire for the wicked and reward for the righteous. Sheol is the grave, the pit, the common destination of every single person who dies, good and bad alike. Listen to how the oldest Hebrew texts talk about it. In the book of Job, a man crushed by suffering longs for Sheol almost as a relief, a place where, he says, the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest, where the small and the great are alike, and the servant is free from his master. That is not a torture chamber. That is the silence of the grave, leveling everyone. In the Psalms, again and again, the dead go down to Sheol, and the haunting refrain is that there is no praise of God there, no remembrance. The psalmist asks, "Do the dead rise up and praise you? In the grave, who gives you thanks?" The dead in Sheol are not being interrogated or burned. They are shades, faint, silent, cut off, barely there. And the book of Ecclesiastes is even more blunt. The living know that they will die, it says, but the dead know nothing. There is no work, no thought, no knowledge, no wisdom in Sheol, where you are going. The same fate, the preacher insists, comes to the righteous and the wicked. They all go to one place. They all return to the dust. So let this sink in, because it overturns the whole popular framework. For long stretches of the Hebrew Bible, the oldest theology of the dead has no two compartments. It has no fiery zone for sinners and no garden for saints with a canyon between them. It has one shadowy underrealm where everyone goes, lies down, and falls silent. The righteous patriarch and the wicked king end up in the same gray place. There is no sorting at the door. Sheol is the great equalizer, and it is, frankly, a little bleak. This is the bedrock under the whole afterlife imagination of the Bible, and it looks almost nothing like the picture in the parable. There is no chasm in Sheol. There is no Lazarus resting in light while the rich man burns in view of him. There is just the pit and the dust and the silence for everyone. Which raises the obvious pressing question. If the foundational Hebrew picture is a single gray grave for all the dead, where on earth did the detailed two-zone map come from? Where did the heaven you can see across a chasm, the comfort and the torment side by side, actually originate? Because it plainly did not come from Job, or the Psalms, or Ecclesiastes. Something happened between the oldest layer and the parable. Something filled the gray pit with structure, divided it, lit a fire on one side, and set a feast on the other. Hold that question, because answering it is going to take us out of Hebrew and into Greek, and into a translation project that quietly changed the way an entire people imagined death. Because here is the hinge. When the Hebrew scriptures were eventually translated into Greek, the translators had to pick a Greek word to stand in for Sheol, and the word they chose was Hades. They took the gray, neutral, silent Hebrew pit, and they laid over it the name of the Greek underworld. And the Greek underworld, unlike Sheol, came with a great deal of furniture. That single translation decision is one of the most consequential word choices in the history of religion, and it is where we are going next. Picture the city of Alexandria, on the coast of Egypt, somewhere in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. It is one of the great intellectual capitals of the ancient world, home to the legendary library, and home as well to a large, thriving community of Jews who no longer spoke Hebrew as their daily language. They spoke Greek, they thought in Greek, and their scriptures were in a language they could no longer read. So a monumental project was undertaken, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. We call the result the Septuagint, a name that comes from a tradition that around 70 translators produced it. The Septuagint became the Bible of Greek-speaking Jews, and later, crucially, the Bible most of the New Testament writers quote. Now put yourself in the chair of one of those translators. You reach the word Sheol. You need a Greek word. And the natural, obvious choice, the word every Greek reader already had in their mind for the realm of the dead, was Hades. So Sheol becomes Hades. Over and over, throughout the translation, the gray Hebrew pit is rendered with the name of the Greek underworld. On the surface, a reasonable swap. Both are, after all, the place the dead go down to. But words are not empty containers. They drag their histories with them. And Hades, for a Greek reader, was not the neutral, silent, undifferentiated pit that Sheol was. Hades was a developed place. Greek myth and Greek poetry had been furnishing it for centuries. In the Greek imagination, the underworld had rivers, it had a ferryman, it had regions. There was a place of punishment, Tartarus, for the truly wicked, where figures suffered famous, ingenious torments. And there were the fields of the blessed, the Elysian fields, a place of rest and reward for the favored dead. The Greek underworld, in other words, already had compartments. It already sorted the dead. It already had something like a torment side and a comfort side. Do you see what happens? The moment you translate the Hebrew word for the gray, equalizing grave, with the Greek word for an underworld that already separates the punished from the blessed, you have quietly imported an entire architecture. A Greek-speaking Jew reading the word Hades in his scriptures would, almost inevitably, hear his own cultural underworld underneath it, with its divisions and its differing fates. The neutral pit of the Hebrew was being read through the structured underworld of the Greek. This is how layers form, not by anyone deciding to change a doctrine, but by a translation choice that lets a foreign set of associations seep in through a shared word. And this seepage did not stay at the level of vocabulary. Over the centuries that followed, Jewish thought genuinely did develop a richer, more divided picture of the fate of the dead. Some of that was internal development, wrestling with questions of justice, the problem that the wicked seem to prosper and the righteous to suffer with no reckoning in this life. And some of it was the slow pressure of living in a Greek-speaking, Greek-thinking world. The end result, by the time we reach the 1st century, is that the old flat picture of Sheol had given way, in much of Jewish imagination, to an underworld with structure. A place where the dead were already, in some sense, sorted while they waited. And this is exactly the world Luke writes in. Luke writes in Greek. When Luke reaches for the word for the rich man's location, he reaches for Hades, the very word the Septuagint had spent centuries loading with structure. He is not inventing a new map. He is inheriting a fused vocabulary in which the gray Hebrew grave and the divided Greek underworld have already merged into one word. The compartments are, in a sense, baked into the language he has available. But vocabulary alone does not give you a beggar resting in honor at a patriarch's side. For that specific, tender image, we need to look at a phrase that has nothing to do with Greek myth at all, and everything to do with a Jewish dinner party. Lazarus, the parable says, was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Abraham's bosom. It is one of the most famous phrases in the whole story, and it has launched 1,000 sentimental paintings of a beggar cuddled against a kindly old man, like a child against a grandfather. But the phrase is more precise and more beautiful than that, and it comes from a very specific piece of ancient social life. To understand it, you have to picture how people of honor ate in the ancient Mediterranean world. They did not sit upright at a table the way we do. At a formal banquet, they reclined, stretched out on couches arranged around the food, leaning on the left elbow, eating with the right hand. And because everyone was reclining in a row, the head of one person would naturally rest near the chest, the bosom, of the person reclining just behind and above them. To recline in someone's bosom at a feast was therefore a position. It meant you were in the place of intimacy and honor, right beside the host, the closest seat in the house. You actually already know this image, even if you never realized it. In the Gospel of John, at the Last Supper, there is a disciple described as reclining on Jesus' bosom, leaning back against him. That is the beloved disciple, in the place of closest honor at the table. Same posture, same word for that warm space at the chest. So Abraham's bosom is not a cosmic nursery, it is a banquet. It is the image of a great feast with Abraham as the host, and Lazarus given the place of honor, reclining right beside the father of the faithful, in the closest, most intimate seat at the table. He is the guest of honor at the patriarch's banquet. And notice what this is, and what it is not. It is not a generic heaven of clouds and harps. That picture does not yet exist in this form. It is a specifically Jewish image, resting at the side of Abraham, the founding father, gathered to your ancestors in honor. Being with Abraham was a deeply Jewish way of imagining the good fate of the dead, joining the great patriarch, included at his side. Now feel the force of the reversal, because the parable has built it with surgical care. In life, Lazarus lay at the rich man's gate, longing to be fed with the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. He was outside the feast, in the dirt, while inside the rich man dined sumptuously every day. After death, the positions are exactly inverted. Now Lazarus is inside, at the feast, in the place of highest honor, reclining against the host. And the rich man is the one outside now, in anguish, begging across a distance for the smallest scrap, a single drop of water, the way Lazarus once begged for crumbs. The man who would not let the beggar in is now the beggar locked out. The banquet imagery makes the reversal complete. And here, finally, the name pays off. Remember, Lazarus means God has helped. In life, that name looked like a cruel joke. The man whose name proclaimed divine help was the one lying sick and starving in the street, apparently abandoned. But now, on the far side of death, the name comes true. God has helped him. The one whom no human helped, whom the rich man stepped over daily, is helped by God in the end, carried by angels, seated in honor. The name was a promise the whole time, waiting for the reversal to reveal it. And the nameless rich man, who had everything, ends with nothing, not even a name to be remembered by. The named beggar and the nameless rich man. That contrast was the clue all along, pointing at who this God actually helps. So we have the banquet of Abraham on one side and the torment of Hades on the other. But where did the idea come from of these as two visible regions, with the blessed and the tormented able to see each other across a fixed divide? That picture is not in the Hebrew Bible. To find its source, we have to open a book that most Bibles leave out entirely. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. The detailed picture in this parable, the dead sorted into separate regions, comfort on one side and suffering on the other, with the two able to perceive each other, even a spring of water in the picture, does not come from the Old Testament. It comes from a body of Jewish literature written in the centuries between the Testaments, books that shaped how Jesus' audience already imagined death long before Jesus opened his mouth. And the single most important of these is a book called First Enoch. First Enoch is an extraordinary, sprawling text attributed to Enoch, the mysterious figure in Genesis who walked with God and was taken. It was hugely influential in the centuries around the 1st century. It survives most fully in an Ethiopic version. It was treasured at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and pieces of it are even quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude. This was not some fringe oddity. It was widely read and widely respected literature in exactly the world Jesus moved in. And in one section of First Enoch, the patriarch is given a guided tour of the cosmos by angels, and that tour includes the dwelling places of the dead. He is taken to a great mountain, and inside it he sees hollow places, deep, smooth, carved-out chambers where the souls of the dead are gathered to wait. And, crucially, these hollow places are divided. The dead are separated according to their lives. There is a place set apart for the righteous, and it has a feature you will recognize. It has a bright spring of water. And there are other places, set apart for the wicked, separated from the righteous, where they wait in distress for the day of judgment. The souls are sorted. They are kept in distinct compartments. And there is water associated with the place of the righteous. Stop and sit with that, because it is genuinely striking. Generations before Luke wrote his parable, a Jewish text already imagined the underworld as a divided waiting room, the righteous and the wicked separated into different chambers, one of them marked by a spring of water, all of them awaiting a final judgment to come. The basic architecture of the rich man and Lazarus, the two regions, the separation, the water motif, the waiting, is already there, sketched out in the apocalyptic imagination of Second Temple Judaism. The chasm, the divide, the visible difference in fates, this is the inherited furniture of a whole tradition. This is what I meant earlier about a borrowed stage. When Jesus, in Luke, tells a story set in a divided realm of the dead with comfort and torment held apart, he is not unveiling a brand new secret map. He is using a stage set his audience already knew. The divided underworld was part of the shared religious imagination. His listeners would have heard the setting and immediately understood the genre, the way you understand the rules of a haunted house the moment the lights drop. The setting was familiar furniture. What was new, what was shocking, was what he did on that familiar stage, who he put in which compartment, and why. So the geography in this parable is not being invented, and it is not being formally taught. It is being assumed. It is the common backdrop, drawn from books like First Enoch, against which the real point is staged. And once you see that the backdrop is borrowed, you start to ask the right question. Not, where is this place, but what is being said with it? But First Enoch is not the only book feeding this imagination. There is another Second Temple text, soaked in the blood of martyrs, that explains something we have been circling. Why this scene uses the word Hades, the waiting word, and pointedly not Gehenna, the final fire. To understand why the parable uses the waiting word and not the fire word, we need to talk about a particular crisis in Jewish history and a particular book that came out of it. The crisis was persecution. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, under a Greek king named Antiochus, Jews were tortured and killed for refusing to abandon their law, refusing to eat forbidden food, refusing to betray their faith. This produced a deep and agonizing question. If a righteous person is tortured to death precisely for being faithful and dies with no reward at all, where is the justice? The old picture of everyone sinking equally into the gray pit of Sheol was unbearable here. It meant the martyr and the torturer ended up in the same silent dust. That could not be right. Out of this crisis came a powerful current of thought, and one of its clearest expressions is a book called 4th Maccabees. 4th Maccabees is a philosophical, deeply emotional work that retells the deaths of these martyrs and reflects on what their faithfulness meant. And it pushes hard toward an idea that was, at the time, still developing. The idea that reward and punishment come not only at some distant final resurrection, but immediately, at death. The martyrs, it insists, do not simply sink into nothing. They pass immediately into a blessed immortality with God and the patriarchs. And their persecutors face a punishment, a divine justice that awaits them. This is a real shift in the Jewish imagination of death, and it is happening in the centuries right before the New Testament. The dead are increasingly imagined not as faint, sleeping shades, but as conscious, aware, already in some sense, experiencing the beginnings of their fate, the righteous in comfort, the wicked in distress, while they wait for the final judgment and resurrection still to come. And this is the precise theological space the rich man and Lazarus occupies. Here is the distinction people consistently miss, and it is the key to the whole Gehenna puzzle we opened earlier. There are, in this developed Jewish picture, 2 different moments. There is the interim, the waiting state right after death, where the dead are conscious and already sorted into comfort or distress, but the final judgment has not yet happened. And there is the final judgment itself, the end of all things, the resurrection, and after it, the fiery fate, Gehenna, the lake of fire, the ultimate reckoning. Now look again at the words. The parable uses Hades. Hades is the realm of the dead, the place of waiting. It is the interim. The rich man is not, in this reading, in the final fire of Gehenna at all. He is in the conscious, distressing waiting state of Hades, suffering in anticipation, before the last judgment has even occurred. That is why the text so carefully avoids the word Gehenna. Gehenna is the final fire after the end. This scene is set before the end, in the in-between. The absence of Gehenna is not an oversight, it is theological precision. Luke, or Jesus, is locating this scene in the interim state, the waiting room, not in the final furnace. That is a genuinely different thing from what the postcard shows you. The postcard says, "This is hell, the final destination, the eternal lake of fire." The text, read carefully, says something more specific and more restrained. This is the conscious waiting place of the dead, already divided, before the last judgment. The flame is real in the story, but the story has carefully not called it the final fire. It is a snapshot of the in-between. So we have placed the scene, an interim realm, borrowed from a developed tradition, staged on familiar apocalyptic furniture. Now, finally, we can turn from the geography to the drama. Because the parable does not actually care very much about the floor plan. It cares about one man and one quiet, devastating sin. A sin so subtle that the story never even names it as a crime. So let us go back to the question we planted at the very beginning, the itch that would not go away. This man is in torment, and the parable never accuses him of a single concrete crime. Read it as carefully as you like. He does not rob Lazarus. He does not beat him. He does not have him driven away from the gate or thrown in prison. There is no fraud, no violence, no blasphemy, no idolatry. By the standards of a courtroom, the rich man has no charge sheet at all. So what exactly is the sin? The answer is in the staging, and it is almost unbearably quiet. The text tells us the rich man was clothed in purple and fine linen, and feasted sumptuously every day. Purple, in the ancient world, was the color of royalty and immense wealth, a dye so costly it signaled the very top of society. Fine linen was the luxury undergarment of the rich, and he feasted, the word suggests, lavishly, brilliantly, every single day. This is a portrait of a man at the absolute peak of comfort and abundance. And then, in the very same breath, the text places another figure right next to him. A poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate. Laid there, as if dumped, too weak to move himself, covered in sores, longing to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table, the scraps, the crumbs, the leftovers. And the only creatures who attend to him are the street dogs, who come and lick his sores, an image of utter degradation and abandonment. The purple and the open wounds, the daily feast and the longing for crumbs, the full table inside and the starving body outside. The contrast is total, and the two are not miles apart. They are separated by a gate. Lazarus is at the rich man's own gate. The suffering man is on the doorstep. That is the sin. Not an action, the absence of an action. Every single day, the rich man in his purple stepped past, or rode past, or was carried past, a starving, sick, dying man lying at his own front gate. And he did nothing. He did not have to be cruel. He did not have to lift a finger against Lazarus. He simply had to keep not noticing. Day after day, the feast went on inside, and the man dying outside might as well have been part of the gatepost. The charge is not cruelty. The charge is indifference. It is the sin of stepping over a human being so consistently that you stop seeing him as one. And that is a far more uncomfortable accusation than murder, because almost none of us are murderers, and almost all of us, every day, step past suffering we have decided not to see. The parable does not give the rich man a dramatic villainy precisely so that we cannot comfort ourselves by saying, well, I would never do that. We would never rob a beggar. But step past one at our gate day after day while we dine well? That charge lands much closer to home, and I think it is meant to. But the parable is not finished twisting the knife on this point, because the deepest revelation of the rich man's character does not come in the description of his life. It comes after he is dead, in torment, in the way he speaks. Watch what he does, even now, even in anguish, when he finally, for the first time, takes notice of Lazarus. He does not apologize. He does not even speak to Lazarus. He gives an order about him. And that single grammatical detail exposes a heart that death itself has not changed. Look very closely at how the rich man speaks across the chasm, because this is the most chilling stroke in the entire story, and it is hiding in the grammar. The rich man, in torment, lifts up his eyes and sees Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side, and he cries out. But notice who he talks to. He calls out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue." Send Lazarus. He is speaking to Abraham. He talks about Lazarus, never to him. Even now, even in this final extremity, the rich man does not address the beggar as a person. He addresses the patriarch, the one with status, and he refers to Lazarus the way a master refers to a servant in the next room. Send him, dispatch him to fetch me water. He still sees Lazarus as an instrument, a tool, a means to relieve his own discomfort. The starving man he ignored at his gate has become, in his mind, the errand boy who should now be sent down to wait on him in his suffering. Think about how staggering that is. Death has happened. Judgment in some form has happened. The whole world has been turned upside down. Lazarus is in the place of honor at Abraham's side, and the rich man is in torment. And the rich man has learned nothing. His instincts are completely unchanged. He still occupies the top of an invisible hierarchy in his own head, with himself as the one who gives orders and Lazarus as the one who fetches. He wants Lazarus brought to serve him. Even in Hades, he is still trying to ring for the help. That is the unchanged heart laid bare. The gate is gone, the wealth is gone, the purple is gone, but the indifference, the assumption that this other man exists to be useful to him, that has survived death intact. And this is what reveals the deeper meaning of the chasm. We were told there is a great gulf fixed between the two regions, so that no one can cross from one side to the other. We naturally picture that as a physical canyon, a geographical feature of the afterlife. But the rich man's words show us what the chasm really is. The gulf is not just in the landscape, it is in him. The same blindness that stepped over Lazarus at the gate is the gulf. A lifetime of treating other people as either useful or invisible has hardened into something now impassable. He built that distance, choice by choice, day by day, every time he walked past the gate. The chasm after death is the shape his own heart took in life, set now in permanence. And listen to how Abraham answers, because his reply is gentle and absolutely final. He does not rage. He calls the rich man child. "Child," he says, "remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are in anguish." And then the line, "Besides all this, between us and you a great gulf has been fixed, so that those who would pass from here to you cannot, neither can anyone cross from there to us." Fixed, set in place. Not by an arbitrary divine cruelty, but, the whole story implies, by a lifetime of fixed choices. The gulf was being dug all along, one ignored morning at a time. And then the rich man refused his drop of water, refused even the comfort of crossing, turns to his last request. He thinks of his 5 brothers, still alive, still feasting, still stepping over their own beggars. And it is in that final exchange, his plea for his brothers and Abraham's answer, that the whole parable detonates and shows us what it was really about. But before we reach that punchline, I want to follow the picture forward in time, because what happened to this story after it was told is its own astonishing chain. We have to watch the postcard get painted. Let us jump forward more than 1,000 years, to the early 14th century, and to one man who, more than anyone, fixed the geography of the afterlife in the Western imagination for good. His name was Dante Alighieri, a poet of Florence, exiled from his city, and the work he produced in those years of exile is the Divine Comedy. And it is almost impossible to overstate what this single poem did to how people picture the next world. Dante gave the afterlife an architecture so detailed, so vivid, and so internally consistent that it effectively became the map in people's heads. He imagined hell as a vast funnel beneath the earth, descending in concentric circles, each ring assigned to a specific category of sin, each with its own fitting punishment, the geography descending tier by tier toward the frozen center. He imagined purgatory as a mountain rising out of the sea on the other side of the world, climbed in terraces, each terrace purging a particular flaw, the souls ascending as they are cleansed. And he imagined paradise as a series of ascending celestial spheres, rising up and up through the heavens toward the presence of God, down through the circles of hell, up the mountain of purgatory, out through the spheres of heaven. A complete, mapped, navigable cosmos. It is a staggering work of imagination, a masterpiece of poetry. But here is what happened to it, and it is exactly the kind of layering this channel exists to trace. Dante wrote a poem. He was a poet building a moral and theological vision in vivid, concrete images, the way poets do. But over the centuries that followed, the poem's architecture seeped out of the realm of poetry and into the realm of assumed fact. The tiered hell, the visible regions, the sense that the afterlife is a place with coordinates and levels and a layout you could draw. That picture, so much of which crystallized in Dante, quietly became the default mental furniture of millions of people who never read a line of him. When a modern person pictures hell as layered and structured, or imagines the saved and the damned as occupying distinct mapped territories, they are, whether they know it or not, walking through rooms that Dante furnished. And then comes the move that distorts the parable. People take that hardened, Dante-shaped, fully mapped afterlife, and they read it backward into the rich man and Lazarus. They come to the parable already certain that the afterlife is a literal place with regions you can see across, and so they treat the parable's imagery as confirmation, as a chapter of the map. The vivid scene of the rich man and the beggar gets absorbed into the great cartographic project, just one more authoritative aerial photograph of the real territory. But you can see now why that is backward. The parable came first, centuries before Dante, and it was using borrowed, assumed apocalyptic furniture to make a moral point to money-loving listeners. Dante came 1,000 years later and built a magnificent poetic cathedral of the cosmos, and then the cathedral was read back onto the parable, as if the parable had been a blueprint for it all along. The reader's confidence that this is a real map of real coordinates is, in significant part, Dante's poetry hardened into supposed geography. The postcard you started with has Dante's brushstrokes all over it, and yet Dante did not start from nothing either. He inherited an imagination already shaped by centuries of Christian art and theology. Because long before Dante put the afterlife into verse, sculptors and illuminators had been putting it into stone and paint, including one very specific, very literal image of Abraham's bosom that turned a banquet posture into a grandfather's lap. To see that, we have to step into a medieval church, walk up to the great doorway of a Romanesque or Gothic church, the kind built across Europe in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and look up. Above the doors, in the great carved semicircular panel we call the tympanum, you will often find the whole drama of the Last Judgment carved in stone. Christ in the center as judge, the dead rising, the blessed led to the right, the damned dragged off to the left into the jaws of a monstrous hellmouth. These tympana, on cathedrals and abbey churches across France and beyond, were sermons in stone, the Bible's most dramatic scenes made visible to people who could not read a word of it. And tucked into many of these judgment scenes, on the side of the blessed, you find a very particular and rather touching image. An old, bearded, seated figure, Abraham, holding in front of him a cloth, a folded sheet held by its corners across his lap. And nestled inside that cloth, like children in a hammock, are small human figures, tiny souls, the saved, gathered up and cradled in the cloth on Abraham's lap. This is the bosom of Abraham, rendered in stone, and you can find versions of it carved into the great medieval churches, the saved souls bundled in the sheet on the patriarch's knees. Now think about what has happened here, because it is a perfect little case study in how a metaphor hardens. Remember what Abraham's bosom originally was? It was a banquet posture. It meant reclining in the place of honor beside the host at a feast, the way the beloved disciple leaned against Jesus at the supper. It was an image of intimacy and honor at a table. But that is a subtle, culturally specific idea, and it is very hard to carve into stone. So the sculptors did what sculptors do. They literalized it. The bosom became a lap. The place of honor at a feast became a physical sheet full of little people sitting on Abraham's knees. The metaphor of reclining beside the host turned into the picture of being held like infants in a cloth. And that literalized image was enormously powerful, precisely because it was concrete and visible and tender. Generations of worshippers, looking up at the tympanum, did not learn that Abraham's bosom meant the place of honor at a banquet. They learned that it meant being gathered as a soul into a cloth on a kindly patriarch's lap. The art taught the meaning, and the art had quietly converted a banquet into a nursery. This is how the visual tradition fixed in people's minds an image that is one full step removed from what the phrase originally meant. When modern people imagine the saved cuddled against Abraham, they are seeing the sculptor's solution, not the banquet hall the words first described. Alongside the tympana, the illuminated manuscripts told the rest of the story in jewel-bright color. In the painted pages of medieval Bibles and books of hours and moralized Bibles, you find the whole parable laid out as a sequence. The rich man at his laden table, dressed in his finery, surrounded by abundance. The beggar at the gate below, gaunt, sore-covered, with the dogs at his wounds. And then the reversal, the rich man's soul carried off by demons into the flames, and Lazarus borne up by angels to that cloth on Abraham's lap. The parable became a picture story, a moral comic strip that the eye absorbed whole, fixing the scene as a literal event in a literal place. And in the process of all this fixing, in stone and pigment and sermon, something else got fixed too. The nameless rich man, the one Jesus had so pointedly refused to name, the one whose anonymity was part of the point, quietly acquired a name. And the way he got it is one of the great accidents in the history of this story. Here is a small mystery for you. If you have ever heard this parable referred to as the story of Dives and Lazarus, and many people across the centuries have, you may have assumed that Dives is the rich man's name. He is not. There is no Dives in the parable. The rich man is, as we have seen, deliberately and pointedly unnamed. So where did Dives come from? The answer is a translation accident, and it is genuinely delightful. Go back to the Latin. For most of Western Christian history, the Bible that mattered in Europe was the Latin Vulgate, the great translation produced largely by the scholar Jerome around the turn of the 5th century. The Vulgate was the Bible of the medieval West for 1,000 years, and when you open the Vulgate to this parable, the opening line about the rich man reads, in Latin, something like, "There was a certain rich man." And the Latin word sitting there for rich is dives. There was a certain man who was dives, rich. Dives is simply the ordinary Latin adjective meaning rich or wealthy. It is not a name. It is no more a name than the English word rich is a name in the sentence, "There was a rich man." But here is what happened. As the parable was read and preached and dramatized across the Latin-speaking centuries, that prominent word dives, standing right at the head of the story, attached itself to the character. Preachers needed a convenient handle for the rich man. The story has Lazarus, a clean, proper name, on one side, and a nameless figure on the other. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does storytelling. The vivid Latin word right there, dives, slid quietly into the empty name slot. The adjective became, by habit and repetition, a proper name. The rich man became dives. And this took on a real cultural life. In medieval sermons, dives became a stock character, the type of the heartless, wealthy man. In the morality plays and religious dramas of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, dives walked the stage as a personified figure, feasting and proud, set against poor Lazarus at his gate, the two of them acting out the lesson for audiences in town squares and guild halls. Dives and Lazarus became a fixed pair, a byword, a moral double act. The phrase entered English. There are old English ballads and folk songs built around Dives and Lazarus, and the very tune associated with that ballad became a well-known English melody that later composers drew upon. The translation accident had become a piece of culture, so sit with the irony, because it is exactly the irony the parable was built around. Jesus, or Luke, very deliberately gave the beggar a name and withheld a name from the rich man. The whole moral architecture, as we have seen, runs on that asymmetry. The poor man is named, seen, individual, remembered. The rich man is anonymous, a type, forgotten. And then the tradition, unable to bear the empty slot, reached into the Latin and pulled out the word rich and handed it back to the rich man as a name. The very anonymity that was the point got quietly undone by a translator's adjective. The man Jesus refused to name got named after his wealth, which is, when you think about it, almost too perfect. So now we have the nameless rich man given a Latin non-name, and the named beggar carrying his Hebrew meaning. And that beggar's name was about to cause a second, far larger confusion, because there is another famous Lazarus in the Gospels, and for centuries people have tangled the two together into one. There are two men named Lazarus in the Gospels, and they are not the same man, and almost everyone, at some point, fuses them. The first is the one we have been with all along, the beggar in the parable in Luke, the poor man at the gate. The second appears in a completely different gospel, the Gospel of John, and his story is one of the most famous in the New Testament. This is Lazarus of Bethany. In John's Gospel, Lazarus of Bethany is a real, located person, the brother of Mary and Martha, a friend of Jesus, living in a village near Jerusalem. He falls sick and dies. And in the climactic miracle of John's Gospel, Jesus comes to the tomb 4 days after the burial, when the body would already be decaying, and calls out, "Lazarus, come forth!" And the dead man walks out, still bound in his grave clothes. Lazarus of Bethany is raised from the dead. He is the man who came back. So now line up the two. In Luke, there is a parable that ends, as we are about to see, with a haunting line about whether people would believe even if someone rose from the dead, and the poor man in that parable is named Lazarus. And in John, there is a man literally named Lazarus who literally rises from the dead. You can feel the gravitational pull. For centuries, readers and preachers and artists drew the two together, sometimes half-consciously, sometimes deliberately, treating the parable's final line almost as a prophecy fulfilled in the raising of Lazarus of Bethany. As if the parable had named its beggar Lazarus precisely to point forward to the man who would come out of the tomb. They are, by the texts themselves, two different figures in two different Gospels. But in the popular imagination, they bleed into one, a single Lazarus who is poor, dies, and returns. And this fusion left a permanent mark on our language, in a place you would never expect. Because the name Lazarus, attached to the sore-covered beggar of the parable, became in the Middle Ages the very word for a particular kind of suffering. The beggar in Luke is covered in sores, diseased, an outcast. And so, when medieval Europe built houses to care for and isolate the most feared of the diseased, the lepers, those institutions came to be called, after him, Lazar houses. A leper was a Lazar. The beggar's name had become the name for the disease of the outcast. And from the Italian form of that same root comes the word lazzaretto, which meant a hospital for lepers, and then, more broadly, a quarantine station, the isolated place where ships' passengers were held to keep plague out of a city. Sit with that for a second. The next time anyone speaks of quarantine, of a lazaretto, of isolation against contagion, there is, buried in the word, the beggar at the rich man's gate, the poor man covered in sores whom no one would touch. His name became our word for the place we put the people we are afraid to touch. The parable's forgotten man left his name on the architecture of exclusion itself. That is a real, surviving, physical trace of this story, hiding in plain sight in the history of our vocabulary. And the fusion of the two men named Lazarus does something more than give us a word. It sharpens, almost unbearably, the parable's final line. Because if the beggar Lazarus and the risen Lazarus blur together, then the last thing Abraham says across the chasm stops being a general observation and becomes a knife pointed directly at the people listening. It is time at last for the punchline. Here is where the whole parable detonates, and it has nothing to do with maps of the afterlife. The rich man refused his drop of water, refused any crossing of the chasm, makes one last desperate request. He thinks of his 5 brothers, still alive, still feasting behind their own gates. And he begs Abraham, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." It is, on its face, almost the first decent impulse the rich man has shown. He does not want his brothers to share his fate. Send someone back from the dead to warn them. And Abraham's reply is the heart of the entire story. He says, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." They have Moses and the prophets. That is, they already have the scriptures. They already have the law and the prophets, which command, on page after page, care for the poor, justice for the needy, the duty not to step over the hungry man at your gate. The warning the brothers need has already been delivered in the books they claim to revere. They do not lack information. They lack the will to listen to what they already have. The rich man pushes back. "No, Father Abraham," he says, "but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Surely a dead man walking back into the room, surely that spectacle would shock them into changing." And Abraham delivers the final line, the one we have been circling since the very beginning. If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Sit with that. The deepest claim of the entire parable is not about the geography of Hades or the temperature of the flame. It is a claim about the human heart. It says that the problem is not a lack of evidence. The problem is not that people have not seen a sufficiently impressive sign. The problem is that hearts which refuse to hear the plain demands of justice and mercy, already spelled out in plain text, will not be changed even by a resurrection. A miracle will not fix what indifference has hardened. If you will not be moved by the suffering man at your gate that you can see with your own eyes, you will not be moved by a ghost. And now feel the dramatic irony land, especially through the fusion of the 2 men named Lazarus. The story is told by Jesus, and the readers of Luke's gospel know what is coming. They know that someone does rise from the dead. They know about a man named Lazarus called out of a tomb, and above all, they know about Jesus himself, risen from the grave. And what does the parable predict? It predicts that, even the resurrection itself, will not convince those who have already refused to listen. The story, told before the resurrection, calmly forecasts that the resurrection will not be enough for hardened hearts. For the early readers, that line must have been chilling, because they had watched it come true. The dead had risen, and still many would not believe. So understand what just happened to our whole reading. The story was never a travelogue. It was never an aerial photograph of the next world. The afterlife scenery, the chasm, the flame, the visible paradise, was the stage. And on that stage, the parable delivered its real payload, which is an indictment of the living. It is aimed squarely at people who have Moses and the prophets in their hands, and a beggar at their gate, and who manage, somehow, to attend to neither. The map was always a mirror, and once you see that, you finally have to ask who, exactly, was standing in front of that mirror when Jesus told the story. Remember the audience. We set them in the room back at the beginning, and now everything snaps into focus around them. Luke tells us, just before this parable, that the Pharisees, who he describes as lovers of money, were listening, and that when Jesus taught about wealth, they scoffed at him, they sneered. And it is into that sneering that this entire story is fired. The lovers of money are the audience. The parable about a rich man who ignored a beggar and ended in torment is being told, deliberately, to wealthy religious men who looked down on the poor and ridiculed a teacher who challenged their relationship with money. That reframes everything, and especially it reframes those 5 brothers. Why 5? Why does the rich man have exactly 5 brothers still living, still in their father's house? Because the 5 brothers are not a detail about the afterlife. They are a mirror turned to face the audience. The brothers are still alive. The brothers still have time. The brothers are feasting behind their gates right now, with their own beggars outside, and they have Moses and the prophets sitting on their shelves. The 5 brothers are the men listening to Jesus. The story reaches out of itself and points at the people in the room. You, it says, are the brothers. You are still alive. You still have the scriptures, and there is still a beggar at your gate. This is what the parable was always for. It is not a survey of the next world delivered to satisfy our curiosity about coordinates and temperatures. It is a warning delivered to the living about how they are living now. The whole apparatus of the afterlife, borrowed from Enoch and the Septuagint, and the developing tradition of the conscious dead, is mobilized for one purpose: to make the listeners feel, viscerally, the weight of what they are doing this very day when they step over the suffering at their gates. It is about hearing the scripture you already hold. It is about now. And once you grasp that the story is aimed at the living, you understand why Abraham's answer about Moses and the prophets is the climax, rather than anything about the flame. The point is not that the rich man went to a hot place. The point is that the brothers, the audience, you, already have everything you need to avoid his path. And the only question is whether you will listen. The afterlife is the frame. The challenge to present action is the painting inside it. The story collapses the distance between the next world and this one and lands its whole weight on the choices being made today, at the gate, with the scripture open on the table. And this, finally, lets us answer the very first question we raised, the one that started this whole excavation. We wondered why the punishment seemed so harsh when the parable never named a single concrete crime. We were troubled that a man could end in torment with no murder, no theft, no violence on his charge sheet. But now we can see that we were reading the parable as a legal verdict, asking what crime earns what sentence, when it was never a courtroom drama at all. It was a mirror held up to people who, like the rich man, commit no dramatic crime and yet every single day do the one thing the whole story condemns. So let us go back, with everything we now know, and finally name the sin that had no name. So let us close the question we opened at the very start. Why is the sentence so harsh when the parable names no crime? Because the crime was the gate. The crime was a closed gate and an open feast, held side by side, day after day, with full knowledge and total indifference. We kept looking for a dramatic offense, a single wicked act, and there is none, because the parable is making a deliberate and devastating point. The thing it condemns is not a spectacular sin. It is the ordinary, respectable, daily sin of comfortable people. The sin of having the means to help a suffering human being at your own doorstep and simply, persistently, not doing it. And notice how careful the parable is about what it does not say. It does not say that the rich man is condemned for being rich. Wealth itself is not the charge. Abraham himself, in whose bosom Lazarus rests, was in the tradition an immensely wealthy man. The problem is not the purple and the linen as such. The problem is what the wealth made possible and what the rich man refused to do with it. His wealth was an opportunity, a standing invitation to act, renewed every single day that Lazarus lay at his gate. And every single day, he declined the invitation. The sin is opportunity refused. It is the gap between what he could have done with a single gesture and the nothing that he actually did. Wealth, in this parable, is not a crime. It is a responsibility that was abandoned, and now the chasm reveals its final meaning, the third and deepest reading of that great fixed gulf. We first met it as a literal canyon in the afterlife, a piece of geography. Then we saw it as moral, the hardened shape of a heart that spent a lifetime keeping its distance. And here is the last turn. The chasm is the gate. In life, there was a gate between the rich man and Lazarus, a threshold the rich man could have crossed with the smallest effort, could have opened any morning he chose, and never did. He fixed that boundary in place himself, choice, by leaving it shut. And after death, that very boundary reappears, but now it is fixed from the other side, and he cannot cross it. The gate he kept closed against Lazarus becomes the gulf that keeps him from Lazarus forever. The distance he insisted on in life is simply granted to him, permanently, in death. He got the separation he chose. He just did not understand, until it was too late, that he was the one who would end up on the wrong side of it. That is why the parable refuses to give him a dramatic villainy. A murderer, a thief, a violent man, those let the rest of us off the hook. We can watch such a figure suffer and feel safely different from him. But a well-dressed man who dines well and walks past the same suffering face every day without ever quite seeing it, that is a figure almost everyone in the audience can recognize from the inside. The refusal to name a crime is the whole genius of it. The parable will not let you say, "That is not me." It leaves the charge as quiet and ordinary and universal as a closed gate, so that the warning can reach anyone who has ever decided not to look. So the harsh sentence was never arbitrary, and it was never really about the temperature of Hades. It was about the gate. Which leaves us with the honest question we have to face now, after stripping away the postcard, the Latin name, Dante's map, and the sculptor's lap. What in the end does this parable actually tell us about the afterlife? And here, the honest answer requires us to listen to the scholars who have spent their lives on exactly this question. So, after all of this, is the parable a map of the afterlife at all? This is where honest scholarship divides, and I want to lay out the genuine disagreement rather than pretend it is settled, because it is not. On one side are readers who take the parable as a real window onto the state of the dead. They point out that Jesus chose this imagery, that he filled it with specific detail, the consciousness, the comfort, and the torment, the recognition across the divide, and that he did not have to do that. He could have told a simpler story. The fact that the picture lines up so well with the developing Jewish view of a conscious interim state, they argue, suggests Jesus was endorsing that view, teaching, through the story, that the dead are indeed conscious and already sorted while they await the final judgment. On this reading, the parable is a genuine, if partial, doctrinal window, and its details about the interim state are meant to inform what we believe about death. On the other side are readers, and this includes a great many careful scholars, who urge real caution about building afterlife doctrine on a parable. Their case is the one we have been assembling throughout. The story uses a known folktale frame, the reversal of fortunes after death that was already circulating in Egyptian and rabbinic forms. It is built on borrowed apocalyptic furniture from texts like 1st Enoch. It is, by genre, a teaching story whose every structural feature drives toward its moral and rhetorical climax, the warning about hearing Moses and the prophets. To extract its scenery and treat that scenery as a literal report, they argue, is to do exactly the thing we warned about at the beginning, to reconstruct the floor plan of the prodigal son's house. The afterlife details on this reading are the inherited stage, not the message, and we should be very slow to turn a single parable into a doctrine of the geography of death. And then, layered on top of that, there is the distinction we drew from 4th Maccabees, which most popular readings miss entirely. Even if you do take the scene as telling us something real, the careful use of Hades rather than Gehenna points to the interim state, the conscious waiting between death and the final judgment, not to the final fiery fate after the resurrection. So even the doctrinally inclined reading, done carefully, does not straightforwardly give you the popular picture of an eternal hell. It gives you, at most, a snapshot of the in-between. The interim state reading and the final judgment reading are genuinely different, and conflating them is one of the most common mistakes made with this text. And here is the honest bottom line. We do not actually know, with certainty, how Jesus or Luke intended the balance between picture and point. We cannot climb inside the mind of a first-century storyteller and measure exactly how literally he meant his furniture. Most scholars lean toward caution, toward reading the afterlife elements as the vivid medium for a moral and rhetorical message, rather than as a surveyed report. But the genuine weight Luke gives the imagery means the question stays genuinely open, and people of real learning and real good faith land in different places on it. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is just where the evidence actually leaves us, which is the perfect place to pull back and see the whole shape of what we have done, because that gap between what the text says and what we are sure it says is the thing this channel exists to sit inside. So let us pull all the way back and look at the distance we have traveled, because it is the distance this whole channel is about. When someone says, "I heard this parable describes hell," that is one kind of claim. And when someone says, "This is what the text actually says," that is a completely different kind of claim. They feel like the same statement. They are not. And between those two claims, in this case, lies an astonishing amount of history. Look at what we found in that gap. Underneath the English hell sits the Greek Hades, and underneath Hades sits the gray Hebrew Sheol, the common grave of all the dead, neither heaven nor fire. Between them stands the Septuagint, the great Alexandrian translation that laid the structured Greek underworld over the neutral Hebrew pit and let the compartments seep in. There is first Enoch, with its hollow places and its dividing of the dead and its spring of water, supplying the furniture before Jesus ever used it. There is fourth Maccabees and the martyrs, shifting the imagination toward a conscious waiting state and explaining why the parable says Hades and pointedly not Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, the final fire. There is Dante, 1,000 years later, hardening the whole afterlife into a mapped cosmos that got read back onto the story. There is the stone of the tympana, turning a banquet posture into a sheet of souls on a grandfather's lap. There is the Latin word dives, an adjective meaning rich, quietly becoming a name for the man Jesus refused to name. And there is the beggar's own name, Lazarus, God has helped, leaking out into our word for a leper house and a quarantine station. Layer upon layer upon layer, painted onto a story that, at its core, was a warning to money-loving listeners about the beggar at their gate. And here is the signature lesson, the one I keep coming back to. The thing at the bottom is more interesting than any of the layers stacked on top of it. The postcard of a fiery hell you can see across is vivid, but the actual parable, read in its own words, is stranger and sharper and lands much closer to home. It was never really a photograph of the next world. It was a mirror held up to this one. Now let me be honest, the way I always want to be. None of this is an argument against faith, and I am not telling you what to believe about the afterlife. Serious, learned, faithful people genuinely disagree about how much of this parable is a window and how much is a frame. They disagree about the interim state and the final judgment, about how literally any of the scenery was meant. I cannot resolve that for you, and I would not trust anyone who claimed they could. What I can do is show you the gap between what the text says and what we have been taught it says, and let you stand in it with your eyes open. That gap is not a threat. It is just worth knowing. So here is my question for you, and I really do want to hear your answer. After everything we have peeled back, do you think the rich man in Lazarus was meant as a map of the afterlife, an actual glimpse of the country of the dead? Or do you think it was always a mirror, a story about Moses and the prophets and the gate you walk past every day? Map or mirror? Tell me where you land and tell me why, down in the comments. I read them. And I will leave you where the story leaves us, with a man across a chasm who once feasted every day, now begging for a single drop of water on his tongue and not receiving it. Whatever else that image is, it is unforgettable. Thank you for going this deep with me. Take care of yourself and watch the gate.